Hello everybody, a very good morning to you. It is 7 o'clock. You are very welcome to join us on The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. The government will set out new plans today to stop migrants who cross the channel in small boats from seeking asylum. Plans which the Home Secretary herself says push the boundaries of international law. The new bill is one of Rishi Sunak's 5 priorities for his time as PM, but critics say unworkable. We'll be live this morning on both sides of the channel, and we'll hear from the Conservative former Justice Secretary Sir Robert Buckland and Jack Straw, the former Home Secretary, who himself fell foul of the law. It's Tuesday, the 7th of March.
And the Home Secretary admits the government is pushing the boundaries of international law as it unveils plans today to tackle small boat crossings.
Refugees who cross from here in France will be banned from seeking asylum. I'll have the latest from Dunkirk.
Questions for police this morning about why it took nearly 2 days to find 5 young people involved in a car accident in Cardiff that left 3 of them dead. Talks begin between the unions and the Health Secretary later this morning as they try to avert more strikes in the NHS. China says it must get closer to Russia as the world becomes more turbulent and issues a warning to the US. A warning that hundreds of community pharmacies could close this year because of rising costs. 3 extraordinary women, all at the top of their field, now brought together by a 20th century plastic icon. But what is it? The Home Secretary will today set out new plans to ban anyone who arrives in the UK in a small boat from claiming asylum. Proponents of the new laws say it shows the government is getting a grip on channel crossings, but critics say the proposals are unworkable and will leave thousands of migrants in limbo. Part of a statement from Suella Braverman published by The Telegraph says, "We must stop the boats, and that's what our bill will do. No more sticking plasters or shying away from the difficult decisions." Myself and also the Prime Minister have been working tirelessly to ensure we have a bill that works. We've pushed the boundaries of international law to solve this crisis. If you come here illegally, it must be that you cannot stay. Let's get more on this, should we? Siobhan is standing by for us in Dunkirk, and Shaman is in Dover for us this morning. Shaman, to you first of all, when will we hear more about the detail of this potential new law?
Well, we are going to hear more detail today as the Home Secretary will be outlining some of what this legislation will look like and how it will likely be implemented. But this is, of course, a serious issue that the government is desperately trying to get a hand on. As we know, back in 2018, the then Home Secretary declared a major incident. And at that time, around 300 small boat crossings had been made. But it was a huge increase, which is why a major incident had been declared. However, figures from last year show that around 45,000 people had made those crossings via those small boats, which are now illegal journeys. So that's from 300 to 45,000 in just a number of years. So, of course, the government is now trying to get a handle on this. We've also already heard of plans to send those who travel via these routes to Rwanda. And the legislation today is expected to expand on that. It will mean that people that enter here via those small boat crossings will be likely sent to Rwanda or another third country. Of course, this has received opposition from various charities that have called these plans unworkable, but public opinion polls show that public opinion is certainly on the government's side.
So looking at it from this side of the channel, I think there are 2 main things to focus on. One, how will the people who are looking to cross respond? And secondly, how will the authorities here respond? And if we take the first one, the initial reactions we've got from people who are waiting in camps here, waiting to cross, is that this isn't going to make any difference. And we have seen in the past that legislation alone doesn't always disrupt these crossings. So, for example, when the Rwanda plan was initially announced, we saw initial nervousness from some in the camps, but then the crossings continued. And in some cases, smugglers even use these announcements to try and speed up the crossings and say, get on the boats now because the window is closing. So there is, some unions warn, a risk that we could actually see an uptick in crossings in the next few days. In terms of how the authorities here respond, well, like everyone else, they're still waiting for the detail. But I think the question is, will this push more of the responsibility back onto the EU? And you've got to remember, it's not just the UK dealing with huge rises in people coming across the channel. The EU has also seen a 64% rise in people crossing its borders illegally in the last year.
OK, ladies, for now, thank you both. Thank you. Well, plenty of developments expected on that story today. We'll bring you all of them here on Sky News, including that common statement from the Home Secretary later on today. And in addition to that, the Prime Minister, we are expecting a news conference from him as well. Meantime, two police forces in Wales are facing questions over why it took nearly 2 days to find 5 young people involved in a car crash after a night out, which left 3 of them dead. Eve Smith and Darcy Ross, both 21, died along with 24-year-old Raphael Jean after the Volkswagen Tiguan they were travelling in came off the A48 motorway in the Welsh capital and crashed into some trees. 2 other people, 20-year-old Sophie Rousson and Shane Loughlin, who's 32, were in the same vehicle. Both survived but remain in a critical condition in hospital. All 5 were reported missing following a night out and were last seen in an area near to Cardiff at around 2 o'clock on Saturday morning. Police issued an appeal on Sunday and officers announced the crash vehicle was found in the early hours of Monday morning following a search involving a police helicopter. However, a friend of the 3 women claims it was members of the public who found the vehicle. Both Gwent Police and South Wales Police say they have referred themselves to the Independent Office for Police Conduct over the handling of the investigation, something they say is in line with normal procedure. The government is in talks with unions representing nurses, ambulance workers and other NHS workers today. Unison will be leading negotiations for the unions and says while bitter pay disputes aren't over yet, there's a potential route out. Let's find out more, should we? Rachel is standing by for us this morning. Hi, Rachel. Good morning. What is that route out?
Well, there looks like there is some wiggle room from the government on pay, both for the last financial year and for the next. We wait to see whether or not a deal can actually be done that satisfies both sides. But, of course, this is positive noises coming both from the unions and from the Department of Health, who've opened up their doors today to 6 unions representing physiotherapists, paramedics, nurses and midwives as well. The talks are going to be starting, we understand, around 10:30, 11 o'clock this morning, and it's all about ending these ongoing strikes, this particularly for the NHS in England. That's what these discussions are all about. And I mentioned pay for the last financial year. This is something that's been a real barrier to negotiations so far. We understand the government isn't prepared to offer a backdated salary for the 22-23 financial year, but there could be a one-off payment on the cards. And they're also thought to be prepared to move on next year's financial offer. Previously, the government had said they could only afford a 3.5% pay increase for NHS members. Perhaps there's some room to manoeuvre there. Now, the unions and the government have said they won't be commentating on the talks as they progress. They're expected to last for at least 3-4 days this week. Also important to point out that junior doctors are not involved in these talks and they are still planning to walk out for 72 hours next week. So while these 6 unions have decided to pause strike action for now, strike action in the NHS very much still an ongoing problem.
OK, for now, thanks very much. Thank you. Looking at the front pages for you this morning, starting with The Sun. No entry reads the front page with The Sun, saying people arriving in small boats will be banned from today. Writing in the paper, Rishi Sunak declares enough is enough. The Mail reports that the crackdown will push human rights laws to the limit, quoting Suella Braverman, while the Eye quotes former Tory cabinet minister who says the migrants plan may be unworkable. And finally, The Telegraph's new lockdown files instalment claims that Matt Hancock discussed blocking funds to MPs who didn't toe the line on lockdown. Meantime, let's look at some of today's other stories for you this morning. A new survey suggests 1 in 7 people has skipped meals because of the rising cost of living. Consumer organisation Which also found that nearly 3/4 of people are turning on the heating less and 1/5 are eating fewer cooked meals. The gender pay gap in the UK has widened because some women are being forced to leave work completely over rising childcare costs. A report by the accountancy firm PwC found that nation's average pay gap widened by 2.4% to 14.4% in 2021. In other words, the gap between what the average man and the average woman is paid an hour has grown. The firm says it will now take more than 50 years to reach gender pay parity in the UK. The King and Queen will celebrate Colchester's recently awarded city status before having afternoon tea in the library with people from Age UK. Colchester officially became a city in November of last year, having been awarded the status during the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations. In a world first, Scotland has banned the use of a type of anaesthetic in its hospitals on environmental grounds. Studies suggest desflurane, a gas which keeps people unconscious during surgery, is 2,500 times more damaging for the environment than carbon dioxide. And later in the programme, discussing the ban with Dr Kenneth Barker from Scotland's National Green Theatres programme. That to come. Also to come on the programme for you this morning, 5:30, the Executive Director of Strategy at the British Red Cross, Christina Marriott, joins us to discuss the new migration plan. With the situation becoming increasingly desperate in the fight for Bakhmut in Ukraine, we'll speak to General Lord Dannett, former Chief of the General Staff. China has warned of conflict and confrontation if the US doesn't change its path towards it and says they are being pushed closer to Russia. Let's get more, should we? Helen Ann is standing by for us in Beijing this morning. Hello to you, Helen Ann. A very good morning to you. So China becoming an increasingly more important player in what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And today we got a bit of an insight into that because it was the first press conference given by a man called Qin Gong. He is the new foreign minister here in China. It's really important to remember that these press events are not really press conferences as we would understand them in the UK. The questions are pre-selected, they are pre-scripted, pre-vetted. The answers are pretty well scripted as well. So it's not really a chance for journalists to challenge the agenda here, but really a chance for this new foreign minister in his new job to lay out his mission statement, if you like. And we really got a sense of that. There was a very lengthy section about those tensions with the United States, very much him laying the blame at the US's door for that and saying that, quote, if the US doesn't put on the brakes, no amounts of guardrails around that relationship would prevent things from deteriorating further, and then, quote, conflict would surely follow. So a clear warning there. He also used the language describing the internal situation in America as a new type of hysterical McCarthyism, he called it. But on that war in Ukraine, lots of attention about China's role in that because it has not taken one side or another. But what he did do today was address accusations from America that China might be preparing to sell arms to the Russians. He said, actually, China is one of the only countries that hasn't provided arms to anybody, and therefore any blame to China is unfair. But crucially, he said has not rather than will not. And there's going to be a lot of attention on that in the coming months.
Now, yesterday, hundreds of thousands of you had a look on Twitter with the story that we thought was worth further debate, and that was whether Boris Johnson's father should be a Knight of the Realm or not. Today, we're really interested to see if you've got a view on this. MPs have been debating whether people over 60 should be charged for their prescriptions. Presently, they're free if you're over 60. Currently, the government is planning to align the upper age exemption for NHS prescription charges with the state pension age of 66, which would mean many more people in their 60s, like you at home and perhaps like your parents, would be ineligible. What do you think about over 60s paying for their prescription medication? Get in touch and tell me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at Kay Burley. Very interested to hear what you've got to say on that, and we will share it with the world. Now, returning to the plans being unveiled today, which are aimed at stopping people from arriving in the UK so-called illegally on small boats. With me is the former Justice Secretary and former Lord Chancellor, Sir Robert Buckland. Hi, it's good to see you.
Good morning, Kay.
How is this plan going to work?
Well, as I understand it, the plans which are going to have an immediate legal effect are designed to restrict the ability of people who come here unlawfully to even claim asylum. Now, that sounds pretty...
They don't come unlawfully, though, do they? They
Well,
don't come unlawfully.
Well, look, my view is that we've got a lot of people here who've come through safe routes, and the Prime Minister quite rightly said that he wanted to do more to expand safe routes of passage and lawful routes of passage. That seems to me to be really important and sensible, because by establishing safe routes, it means that people who are either exploited or are using these routes to come over the small boats route clearly aren't taking advantage of what would be safe and legal routes of passage. Now, it's very difficult for the government. I absolutely understand the quandary they're in. I was having to wrestle with it when I was in government, and clearly there's massive public concern about the seeming inability of the authorities to deport people who've exhausted their rights of appeal here in this country. Now, if the legislation is able to fairly deal with that, I think it will deserve support. But I think this is going to be judged by practice and what happens in the next few months. That's going to be vital, I think.
Sure, but presently it is not unlawful to travel across the Channel like this. It's unlawful to smuggle people across the Channel like this, but these people who are seeking a better life in the United Kingdom are not acting unlawfully. We've heard from the Home Secretary today. She's written in the Telegraph saying, we've pushed the boundaries of international law to solve this crisis. Well, that's going to be challenged time and again in the courts, isn't it?
Well, it does sound like it. I mean, I've had assurances that the government isn't seeking to break international law. That's its obligations under European Convention on Human Rights, the Refugee Convention. I welcome that, because I think a lot of other countries in Europe and elsewhere are struggling with this problem. And I think it would be a bit of a free-for-all for everybody to try and do their own thing in a way that is not coordinated. There have to be there has to be a proper process to allow genuine claimants, of which we get many into our country, to make their claims in a proper way. So I'll be looking very carefully to see in this new legislation whether there will still be those exceptions to allow perhaps the woman from Iran who refuses to wear the hijab, or the refugee coming from a war-torn part of the world who clearly is coming for the right reasons, to be able to seek asylum here in the UK. That's our tradition, and I think it's something that we should support.
Okay.
Even though we do need to deal with what has become a really pernicious problem.
OK, 5 years ago, the then Home Secretary Sajid Javid said there were rising numbers of small boats and it was a major incident, he was going to sort it. 2 years ago, Priti Patel promised to stop gangs and to push boats back if necessary. Rishi Sunak has previously said, we've heard plans like this before. We've heard plans like this before.
I know, and we've had a lot of over-promising and under-delivering. What I like about the tone and approach of this Prime Minister is that he acknowledges that this is a huge challenge. It's not easy. I think what he wants to do is go one step at a time, but also not just rely on legislation here in Westminster, but to take action more generally and internationally to see what can be done to avert the problem from reaching the Channel in the first place. And that's why I think his talks with the French government are going to be very important. It's clear to me that...
We've given them £300 million since 2014. What have we got to show for it?
Well, I mean, this is an issue. It does seem to have been thus far that there's been a reluctance to do something really deep-seated here. I think mainly because the French think that there should be a negotiation with the EU more generally. And, of course, they have a point that, refugees or people seeking to come to Western Europe, it's not about national borders. It's about the fact that Western Europe is an attractive place to come economically for many, many people. And therefore, it seems to me that international action, for example, action that could end the camps in the north of France, that could end the way in which, in effect, there's a route of passage through which allows exploitation, needs to be the order of the day. And the Prime Minister, has said that he wants to do more internationally. He announced that deal with Albania, which I thought was a significant breakthrough. Kay, there's no poetry in this. There's no simple, sweeping answer. It's going to take hard grind and individual action with certain countries which are the source of the problem.
But as geopolitics changes, will it not correct itself?
Well, look, I don't have a crystal ball. I think we can say that with the geopolitics of the sub-Saharan region, the geopolitics of Eastern Europe, we are facing increasing conflict, a lack of resources, a fight for those resources. Western Europe is seen as a safe haven economically and politically. We are going to be an attractive place for people to come, and we're not sundered by thousands of miles of sea.
Some people might say, what's wrong with that?
Well, look, I've always said that where people have a genuine reason to want to seek asylum, then we should welcome them. We've always done so. We've done so for hundreds of years. But it is important that our fare systems are not abused and that we are not, in effect, taken for a ride by people who are exploiting others and who are seeking to make a profit out of criminality.
We spent a fortune, as I said, with the French, 300 million. We've given the Rwandan government 200 million thereabouts, £500 million. What have we actually got to show for it?
Well, I think with Rwanda, we're very much in the early stages of
we're
that
not, though.
scheme.
It was Priti Patel who came up with that.
It was.
And not one person has been sent to Rwanda.
And I think that the High Court has ruled that the framework is lawful. They were very critical of the individual cases that were processed. Clearly, the Home Office has got to do its homework and do better in order to process cases like that. But I think Rwanda is actually a small part of a bigger response that is needed. As I've mentioned, I think it's essential that we do a further and comprehensive deal with France and indeed other European countries if we can, and that the Prime Minister uses a raft of different approaches here in order to deal with a problem that, if this particular manifestation of small boats disappears, might pop up again in lorries, as we had some years ago.
I get that there's an increase in small boats because you've managed to plug the gap when it comes to lorries. I get that. But nevertheless, 40,000 people, 45,000 people came across the Channel last year. Something like 200, even if it does work, will be going to Rwanda. What are you going to do with the others?
Well,
what do you think about this idea about dilapidated cruise ships or old military camps?
Well, I mean, military camps...
Sounds inhumane.
Well, they have to be humane. And I'm not against the idea of using sensible facilities that can work in a humane way. Hotels are clearly a very expensive option here. In fact, the only option that the government has at the moment, and that's not proving to be a universal success, to say the least. So I understand the quandary that the government is in, but unless there is more of an international approach to this, and unless there is that attempt to try and root out the cause of this and the roots that I used, then I think that legislation on its own will not achieve the results that some people think that it can achieve.
Let me put this to you finally, if I may, Sir Robert, and that is, I'm sure it'll be a surprise to a lot of our viewers this morning, the biggest number of people who have stayed illegally in the United Kingdom are those that have overstayed their visas, and they've come here legally. What are you going to do about them?
Well, Kay, it's a very, very good question. There's clearly an issue here as to process and as to the way in which these particular regimes are policed. I think that we've got to be honest about migration. My view is that if students are here, as long as they're going back at the end of their courses and are not outstaying their visas unlawfully, I don't really think we should be counting them as immigrants in the sense of people wanting to stay here permanently. If you do that, you get a much more realistic sense of what is going on. But, you know, I've said for a long time, we have a number of people here who've come to this country, slipped through the net, are probably working under the radar, not paying their tax. We need to address that issue as well. And that's why I think that, you know, with all these backlogs of people waiting for their claims to be processed, why aren't they putting something productive back into our society? Perhaps they do some work. Well, Kay, my view is that I think we should.
Yeah.
You know, I've said after 6 months they should be working, and then we'll know where they are.
We won't be able to if we put them on a cruise ship, will we?
Well, yeah, look, I think that there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions to this problem that actually don't get near solving it. And what I'm hearing from the Prime Minister is a much more grown-up approach to this, an honest assessment that this is tough, but also an acknowledgement that legislation on its own will not be enough, and that unless we get that international cooperation, this problem will not be solved for Britain and indeed for other countries in Western Europe that are facing equal pressures.
Sir Robert, it's always great to see you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Kay.
You. This is a thought for people who are potentially sleeping rough tonight, and we do see a lot of them not only on the streets of the capital but right around the country. Tonight could be the coldest night of the year so far. The Met Office is warning a yellow weather warning for snow and ice is in place for parts of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, with a late winter blast sending very cold Arctic air sweeping across the UK. Should we get more on that? Joe is standing by for us. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Kay. Yes, covering of snow where I am on the grass here and on the cars, but the pavements are still clear. But some icy stretches this morning, and like you say, there are warnings in place. And last night wasn't quite as cold as we've seen so far earlier in the year, down to -8 degrees Celsius in Scotland. But we could see in the coming nights -10 to -15 degrees Celsius. So those are the temperatures at the moment. So a very cold start in the north, not quite as cold in the south. It's actually 7 degrees in Newquay. And then there are warnings in place, and the warning across northern Scotland and across northeast England covers throughout the day. Snow showers there, could see a further 10 centimetres in places. The warning across Northern Ireland and then across parts of Wales and central and southern England. Those will expire at 10 a.m. this morning. But there are further warnings through the course of the week, so it is worth keeping an eye on the forecast. There'll be further snow possible in the south on Wednesday, and then that risk transfers further north, where we could see greater impacts across northern parts on Thursday and Friday. So it's worth keeping an eye on the forecast.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
A northerly flow bringing very cold air, especially to the north, with a risk of snow, ice and, as Joe was saying, overnight frost.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Time now for a look through some of the photos that have caught our eye today. Here we go, into the world of the ancient Egyptians. Archaeologists have unearthed a sphinx-like statue and the remains of a shrine in an ancient temple in southern Egypt. Archaeologists believe the statue's smiling features may belong to the Roman Emperor Claudius. Claudius, who extended Rome's, that was a northern joke, Rome's rule into North Africa between 41 and 54 AD. The archaeologists also found a tablet dating to ancient Roman times with demotic and hieroglyphic inscriptions. That's what they are. Top stories for you this morning. The Home Secretary admits the government is pushing the boundaries of international law with new legislation to tackle small boats crossing the Channel. Questions for police in Wales over why it took nearly 2 days to find 5 young people involved in a car crash in Cardiff that left 3 of them dead. Talks begin between the unions and the Health Secretary later this morning as they try to avert more strikes in the NHS. Well, the former Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor Sir Robert Buckland was here earlier. I asked him about the Home Secretary saying that the government is pushing the boundaries of international law to the limit with the new migration plans.
I've had assurances that the government isn't seeking to break international law. That's its obligations under European Convention on Human Rights, the Refugee Convention. I welcome that because I think a lot of other countries in Europe and elsewhere are struggling with this problem. And I think it would be a bit of a free-for-all for everybody to try and do their own thing in a way that is not coordinated.
So what sort of challenges is the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary facing? Nobody knows better than our Tamara. Hi, good morning.
Morning, Kay. Well, Rishi Sunak promised at the beginning of this year to stop the small boats. And speaking to Conservative MPs last night, some of them wondering why he didn't say limit them, restrict them, reduce it, because stopping small boats sounds like a huge undertaking, which it's going to be very difficult to do. Now, the way the government are proposing to do this, having, as Robert Buckland acknowledged, overpromised and underdelivered on this in the past, is a new legal route. They're going to put in this bill, which we will see the details of today, a duty to remove anyone who comes across the Channel and make sure that that is put above considerations such as their right to claim asylum, their right under modern slavery laws and their right under human rights laws. Now, of course, there will be exemptions for under 18s, for people who are described as having a serious illness. But the government also want to do something they haven't tried before, which is to backdate it to when the bill is published, to today, so you don't get a rush of people trying to come in before this legislation is passed. Now, it's going to take probably quite a long time, months, even longer, for this to get through Parliament, and what effect it will end up having is difficult to say. It's been very difficult to do this in the past, and everybody who comes over may be able to question the decision. The idea that you could put 45,000 people who crossed the Channel last year into detention and then remove them all, given what the numbers have been looking like over the last year, seems to many looking at it to be a very difficult task.
OK, for now, tomorrow. Thanks very much indeed. Well, we are going to be talking about this story throughout the day today. It's something like 45,000 people travelled across the Channel last year in these small boats. It's important to underline that their actions are not illegal, despite what the government would have us believe. Those that smuggle them, very much illegal act, and there are attempts to try to track them down in some numbers. We'll be hearing from the Home Secretary in the House of Commons later on today, and then the Prime Minister will be holding a news conference late afternoon, is what we're hearing. Well, the Executive Director of Strategy for the British Red Cross, that's Christina Marriott, is with us. Hi. Good morning. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on the programme. We're hearing from the Home Secretary that she's going to stretch international law to the limit, and then it is going to be illegal to cross the Channel in a small boat.
We struggle with how that can be illegal, because under the international conventions, people have the right to come to a country to claim asylum. And this is one of the problems with what we think is proposed in the bill. To claim asylum in the UK, you have to reach the soils of the UK, unless you come from Ukraine or Hong Kong, or you're one of the very lucky 1,400 people who last year we resettled through the international schemes. So people have to come to the UK in order to be able to claim asylum. Under this bill, it's proposed that once they reach the UK, they will be taken out of the asylum system. And we think this puts a real catch-22 right at the heart of our asylum system, because we wonder, if you are fleeing persecution or war, if you are running from Afghanistan or Syria in fear of your life, how are you going to be able to claim asylum in the UK?
But Afghanistan and Syria are very different to countries like Albania, aren't they?
They are, and that's why we have an asylum system. So we know that they have very different rates of gaining asylum when they apply.
So you do think Albanians should go back home?
I think if they don't have a valid asylum claim, then we are in support of people being returned to countries. But what we need for that is a really fair and fast asylum system, and that's what we don't have at the minute. So, for example, 98% of people from Afghanistan and Syria who claim asylum receive it for very good reasons. We know that they are in fear of their lives. We know the rates for Albanians are very different. I don't think we know everything about Albanians at the moment, but we do know their rates through the asylum system are very different, and we would agree with returns.
Why don't people seek asylum in the first safe country, which is not the UK?
So there's no legal requirement for them to do so under the conventions, and one of the reasons is the conventions are there to globally spread the load. Actually, what happens is the vast majority of people either stay in the country that they're from, they're just internally displaced, or they do stay in the neighbouring country, and that's why we see really high rates of refugees in countries like Turkey and Colombia and Uganda. The vast majority of refugees are in Africa, Asia, South America, close to where they've come from.
But why then do people get on a small boat on the coast of France and make that absolutely terrifying crossing in those very small dinghies, inflatables, many of which don't make it and have to be rescued or worse, to the United Kingdom? Is it because we're an easy touch?
So what the evidence shows, the Home Office commissioned their own research, and what we hear working with 30,000 refugees and asylum seekers every year is time and time again we hear that people actually don't know what the asylum system is here, and they also don't know what the welfare system is here. They don't think of us as a soft touch because they don't know the detail.
So why do they come?
They come for a variety of reasons. We hear from some people that they actually don't know where they're being taken to by smugglers. Sometimes they come because they have family here already. Sometimes they come because they speak English. English is a global language, and people hope to rebuild their lives well in Britain.
If they've got family here, they know what the opportunities are. They know what the welfare system is.
we do find a degree of naivety about, and when we think about the welfare system for those seeking asylum, it's less than £7 a day. It's actually much less generous than most of Europe. And if we look at things like asylum rights, they're also less generous than the EU. So in the EU, for example, if you're an unaccompanied child, you can request for your parent to join you. So if you're a child on your own who's reached a country, you can request for your parents to join you. In the UK, you can't. So actually, we're not a soft touch in terms of our asylum law.
So how do we fix it? Because, you know, the government has to, some would say, in order to win the next election, they need to be seen to be doing something about migrants coming here to the UK to seek asylum. What would you suggest they do?
So we need to get really pragmatic here. What we can't do is hope that deterring people will work, because we know they don't know about the asylum system, and therefore just hoping that getting tougher and harsher will work, because it won't. What we need to do is speed up things like our asylum system. So our productivity of the asylum system has really dropped. Back in 2014, 9 in 10 people got their first decision in the first 6 months of their application. Last year, it was less than 1 in 10 people got it. And that's where the backlog is. What we need is higher productivity in the Home Office, which allows people to get through the asylum system faster. And then if they are genuine refugees, they can be allowed to work, resettle, start contributing to the UK. And if they're not, then we can think about returning people. We don't think this bill will work, because we don't think it will deter people because they don't know, and we think the government will struggle to return people to other countries because they won't have been through an asylum system. And that takes both those people and the UK taxpayer into a limbo we can't find a way out of, because we're not making a decision.
Final thought, Christina. Disused cruise ship sounds like a cushy life to some.
It really isn't. Disused cruise ships with an indefinite detention, we know, is really damaging to people's mental health, to their physical health. We know people want to work and rebuild lives, and being trapped in a prison, whether it's a floating prison or not, is not a cushy life. It's an indefinite limbo, which is very, very bad for people. And it's very bad for the UK as well.
It's good to see you. Thanks for joining us on the programme. Thank you. Still to come, he's been called the world's greatest living explorer, and today he's celebrating his 79th birthday. Who is it? Find out after the break.
The press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
There's a feeling amongst some commentators that it's not the most respectful timing.
I think there's a word for it, fake news.
I mean, it's wow, wow, wow from Harriet.
Delving deeper into the stories with different perspectives on tomorrow's headlines.
We really haven't seen the government getting round the table and negotiating. Why did they do that?
There are no easy answers to those questions.
The press preview delivering you tomorrow's news tonight on Sky News.
Now, before the break, we were asking you which world record-breaking explorer turned 79 today. Do you know? Here he is, Ranulph Fiennes. He was the first person to travel by surface to both poles and the first to cross Antarctica by foot among more than 30 expeditions. He also holds the record for the oldest Briton to successfully climb Mount Everest, which is pretty impressive. He's endured some of the coldest and most hostile places on the planet, losing several fingertips to frostbite in the process. If you haven't read his account of losing the tips of his fingers and how he managed to cut them off, then check out his book. He is an amazing human. Meantime, Ukraine's top generals and President Zelensky are vowing to fight on in Bakhmut, the eastern city besieged by Russian forces. Moscow is trying to secure its major battlefield gain in more than 6 months. Speaking in his nightly address, President Zelensky said his advisers had unanimously agreed to boost Ukraine's defences there after reports last week that Ukrainian defenders may retreat. Well, General Lord Dannatt, former Chief of the General Staff, is here with me this morning. Hi, my Lord. It's good to see you. Thanks for joining us. What's going to happen, do you think, in Bakhmut?
Well, it's interesting. Of course, it's interesting. On Sunday, when I was talking with your colleague Sophie on the morning programme, it looked very much as if the Ukrainians were going to withdraw, and that actually seemed quite sensible, because Bakhmut, for them, had almost achieved its purpose, turning out to be a killing ground for very large numbers of particularly Wagner Group soldiers. But reports over the last 24 hours or so indicate that there's growing disquiet within the Russian ranks, tension between Prigozhin, the Wagner chief, and other Russian generals. So I think what Zelensky has now decided on advice of his generals is actually, no, we're going to hold on in Bakhmut because our presence there is causing dissent and confusion and disharmony amongst the Russians. So it could be quite a clever move to have changed what was going to be their tactical move.
A lot of people would struggle to find Bakhmut on a map. Why is it strategically important?
It's not. It is in central eastern Ukraine. It's become totemic. It's become totemic largely because the Wagner group wanted to show that they could capture somewhere that the Russian army couldn't do. This goes back to last autumn. And for the last 6 months, almost incessantly, wave after wave of Russian, but particularly Wagner-recruited ex-prisoners, many of them, have been thrown away in trying to capture Bakhmut. Now, from the Ukrainians' point of view, they've managed to hold on in their defensive positions, and they've killed tens of thousands of Russians. So it's become totemic insofar as Russia really wanted to have a victory, which they've been denied, and the Ukrainians have been perfectly capable of holding on. And it sounds rather gruesome to say, take satisfaction from the large number of casualties that they've inflicted on the Russians. So strategically, it hasn't got much significance, but tactically, it's turned out to be quite important.
I was listening to an account of the eastern part of Ukraine, a suggestion that the life expectancy for some Russian soldiers in varying parts was 3 hours, which is alarming. Where has this spring offensive that we were hearing about, what's happened?
Well, I don't think we've really seen the start of the fabled Russian spring offensive. I think at some stage they have got to use in large numbers, not just the Wagner group, but in large numbers the 200,000-300,000 we understand that they conscripted towards the end of last year. But if one thinks about it, how much training will they have had, particularly during this winter? The clothing they've been equipped with is terrible. And usually the winter has been Russia's friend. I think in this case, their hastily mobilised, poorly trained, poorly clothed, poorly equipped army has had to really suffer during the winter. So I think we may well see some form of more concerted attempt by the Russians to mount an offensive. But on the evidence of everything we've seen, it'll fail. It'll be characterised by massed infantry attacks backed up by artillery. But attacking prepared Ukrainian positions, many young Russian men will lose their lives, which will be a tragedy.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's talk about the Commons Defence Select Committee, if we may. The committee says it could take 10 years to rebuild Britain's supply of ammunition. That's alarming.
It is alarming. Of course, British industry could do anything if it was minded to do so. But I think industrialists have got to believe that there is cash behind what the MOD is asking them to do, and that there is a political determination to say, we must get on and we must do this, we must replenish our stocks as quickly as possible. And I think we're not hearing yet strong enough political determination to increase our defence budget, to make good the stocks that we've been expending, and indeed, and I would say this, and I've said it so many times before, actually increase the priority of spending on defence for our land forces. This land war in Europe over the last year has been a very rude wake-up that land warfare is not over. Main battle tanks still have a role to play, and we've really got to understand that, commit to it, additional money, particularly for our land forces, and of course, as we were just suggesting, making up the deficit of our ammunition stocks that we have given quite properly to Ukraine.
And that land force, some of it is 50 years old.
Well, Kay, it is. It's our Challenger main battle tanks, our Warrior armoured infantry fighting vehicles, our AS-90 self-propelled guns, were all equipments that came in the late 1980s at the height of the Cold War and played a really significant role. This was Margaret Thatcher's government, after all. She and Ronald Reagan really led the West in a very concerted fashion at that time. And it was because we were putting more money into our conventional weaponry at the time, so it was one of the factors that actually led eventually to the collapse of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union. The fact they're 50 years old doesn't matter so much. The hardware doesn't deteriorate. The critical thing is upgrades to the software, to the equipment, to the anti-drone devices. All the sort of modern, or the aspects of modern warfare need to be added on to these armoured vehicles.
Do you think that NATO is as united as it should be towards helping what's happening in Ukraine?
by and large, today it is. The question is, what happens tomorrow? I think there is a danger, and of course this is one of Putin's games, that he's been trying to extend this war in the hope that the cost of supporting Ukraine will be felt by some Western countries to be too great, probably hoping that the United States presidential election will produce another government there that will take a different view. So I think today NATO is pretty cohesive. What happens tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, I think that's the open question.
OK, it's good to talk to you, my lord. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme. Thank you. Quick look at what's happening as far as the weather's concerned.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Northerly flow bringing very cold air, especially to the north, with a risk of snow, ice and overnight frosts.